Fear is a universal emotion, one that can paralyze us, make us question everything around us, and ignite a primal instinct to protect ourselves. But it's not always the obvious dangers that frighten us the most. In fact, the things we fear the most are often those we cannot see, those we cannot understand, and those we cannot explain. The terrifying aspect of fear lies not only in the unknown but in the helplessness we feel in confronting it. I remember the first time I felt true fear, and not just any ordinary fear, a deep, gut-wrenching terror that consumed me, leaving me shaken and questioning the very fabric of reality. It wasn't the usual things we fear, dark alleys, creepy old houses, or loud noises in the night. This fear crept up on me in a more insidious way, a slow, creeping sensation that gnawed at my insides, subtly building up until it reached a crescendo of panic. It was a normal day, or at least I thought it was. Like many days before, I came home from school, threw my backpack in my room, and went about my usual routine. My brother, Alex, was downstairs in the kitchen, likely making a snack or grabbing a drink, while my parents were still at work. Everything seemed mundane, just another day, a normal, quiet afternoon, but there was something about the stillness in the house that felt off. As I grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen, the silence was almost deafening. The air was thick with an unease I couldn't quite pinpoint. The walls of the house, which usually felt like a safe sanctuary, suddenly seemed too close, as if the very structure of the building was closing in around me. It's a sensation I had never experienced before, and one I can never quite forget. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off, dismissing the growing anxiety as nothing more than overactive imagination. I even told myself that it was just the normal feeling of being home alone, an unsettling quiet that seemed to amplify every sound. But deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't normal. When I walked upstairs to use the bathroom, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. The layout of our house didn't help matters. The bathroom, located at the end of a short hallway, was directly across from my brother's room, which made it feel like I was constantly being observed. Every little sound seemed louder, every movement in the corner of my eye more significant. I tried to focus on the task at hand. But the feeling of unease only grew, and then, it happened. A noise, a loud, sudden thud, echoed through the house. I froze. It wasn't the sound of something falling, or a door creaking. It was a thud, a heavy, deliberate noise that seemed to come from my brother's room, but I was certain Alex wasn't there. I hadn't heard him leave, and the house was far too quiet for someone to be moving around without me hearing them. I tried to dismiss it, but my gut told me something was wrong. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, a normal sound, but it didn't feel like that. My heart started to race, and my breathing became shallow. It was as if my body knew something I didn't, a primal instinct telling me that something was amiss. So, as we walk through life, it's crucial to remember that the path we take is rarely straightforward. There will be moments of darkness, moments of fear, moments when we question everything we know to be true. But it is in those moments that we learn the most about ourselves. And it is in those moments that we find the strength to continue on, knowing that the journey itself, with all its twists and turns, is what shapes us into who we are meant to be. As you move forward, take this lesson with you: the unknown is a part of life, and sometimes, the most terrifying experiences are also the ones that teach us the most. Embrace the fear, respect the mystery, and never stop seeking answers. Because, in the end, it's not the answers that matter, it's the courage to ask the questions. The final lesson to take away from that night is the importance of connection to the people around us, and to the world we inhabit. How, Maya, and I experienced something together that none of us will ever forget. It brought us closer, it bonded us in a way that few experiences could. In that moment of terror, we relied on each other. We ran together, fought together, and survived together. It was a reminder that, no matter how alone we may feel at times, we are never truly isolated in our struggles. Our shared humanity, our connections with others, are what allow us to endure the hardships and face the unknowns that come our way. in the end, this story is more than just a terrifying camping trip. It is a story about confronting the darkness, both in the world around us and within ourselves, and coming out stronger on the other side. It's a story about embracing the mystery, recognizing our vulnerability, and accepting the unknown as an integral part of life. We may never have the answers to all of life's questions, but that doesn't mean we stop asking them. It doesn't mean we stop seeking the truth, even if that truth is elusive, even if it leads us into the depths of fear and uncertainty. This leads us to the third lesson, the importance of facing our fears. That night, I learned that fear is not something to be dismissed or avoided, it is something to be acknowledged, respected, and faced head-on. Fear has a way of paralyzing us, of making us feel small and insignificant, as though we are powerless against the unknown. But when we face it, when we allow ourselves to truly experience it, fear loses some of its power over us. We may not always have the luxury of running away from our fears, as we did that night, but we do have the ability to confront them. The scream that echoed through the forest that night was a reminder that fear is real and raw, but so too is our capacity to overcome it. To push through it, and to learn from it. Whether it's the fear of the unknown or the fear of something more personal, our ability to face those fears head-on is what shapes us into who we are meant to become. In addition, this experience also serves as a reminder that sometimes, we are not meant to fully understand the mysteries we encounter. The creature that stalked us in the woods that night will forever remain an enigma. We will never know what it was, why it was there, or what its intentions were. But that's okay. Not everything in life can or should be explained. Some mysteries are better left untouched, for they are the very things that provoke curiosity, spark imagination, and inspire the questions that push us forward in our search for knowledge. The fear we experienced that night was a reminder that some things in life are simply beyond our understanding, and that's part of what makes life so thrilling and mysterious. This is where the lesson of awareness becomes crucial. It's not just about knowing your surroundings on a surface level, it's about tuning into the subtler signs, the things that feel off, that don't align with your expectations. In the quiet of the night, when the firelight flickered and the sounds of the forest faded, I should have recognized the warning signs earlier. The unnatural silence, the heavy presence that seemed to press against the air, the unease in Hal's voice, all these were signals that we were not alone in the way we thought we were. We were conditioned to ignore these signs, to rationalize them away as mere coincidence or imagination. But when something doesn't feel right, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, it's often worth listening to that instinct, because sometimes it's trying to protect you from something much darker than you realize. Secondly, the experience reinforced the importance of humility in the face of nature. The wilderness, for all its beauty and serenity, is an unpredictable force. It doesn't care about our plans, our expectations, or our comfort. We are visitors in its domain, and it is often quick to remind us of that fact. The forest that night, with its hidden dangers, taught me that there is much about the natural world that we can never fully control or understand. The creatures that roam it, the forces at play, are often beyond our grasp. While we may take pride in our advances in technology and knowledge, nature has a power all its own, a power that reminds us of our vulnerability. It is a humbling realization, but one that forces us to acknowledge that there are forces in this world that are far more mysterious than we could ever fathom. The woods had shown us a side of reality that we weren't ready to face, a side of nature that wasn't kind or welcoming. It reminded us that there are forces out there, in the vast, uncharted spaces of the world, that we cannot understand, and sometimes, it's better not to try. Nature, beautiful as it may be, can be cruel and indifferent, and there are things in the dark that may not belong to this world at all, and as for the creature we encountered, we'll never know what it was. We'll never understand what we heard or what we saw, but we know one thing for sure, it was real. And it is out there, waiting, in the shadowed corners of the wilderness, just beyond the reach of our understanding. Then, the worst thing imaginable happened, I heard Maya scream. It was a blood-curdling, terror-filled scream that echoed through the night. Without thinking, I bolted out of the tent, running toward her. Hal was already there, yelling for her to get out, but she was frantic, backed into a corner of the tent, shaking. Whatever had been stalking us had found her, and it wasn't leaving. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward me, urging her to run. We sprinted through the dark, the sounds of heavy breathing and footsteps following closely behind. I could feel something moving in the darkness, something large and relentless, just out of reach. My legs burned as I ran, but I didn't dare stop. We had to make it to the car, had to get out of there. I could hear the creature getting closer, the ground shaking with its every step. We reached the car, Hal fumbling to get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt trail, away from the woods. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been chasing us was still out there, watching, waiting. We didn't stop until we were miles away from the woods, the panic still gripping us. That night, we left everything behind, the tents, the gear, the firewood. It didn't matter anymore. What we had experienced was beyond explanation. The terror we felt wasn't just a fleeting fear, it was something that had seeped into our souls, something that left an indelible mark. Hal, ever the skeptic, was speechless. He had never encountered anything like that before. Neither had I. And neither of us ever wanted to again. The footsteps continued, circling us, getting closer, always just out of sight. The sense of dread grew stronger, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't just the footsteps that frightened me. It was the sound that accompanied them, a clicking, low growl that didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a bear? A large predator of some kind? But no, Hal was calm, too calm. He said it was just the wind, that animals made strange sounds sometimes, especially at night, but this wasn't just any sound. There was something wrong about it. It didn't belong in the natural world. It was as though something had crossed over from a place we couldn't see. From a dimension beyond our understanding. At Hal's insistence, we retreated to our tents, though I felt no safer there. Inside, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the low, grating noise of whatever was out there, scraping against the ground. Then, without warning, a shadow loomed on the wall of my tent. It was massive, bipedal, moving with a deliberate, predatory grace. I froze, my blood running cold. The footsteps outside were now heavy, slow, as though something enormous was pacing back and forth, just outside our small circle of light. I held my breath, afraid that the slightest noise would give away my position. I could hear Maya's breathing, shallow and quick. As terrified as I was, I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. We were isolated, cut off from the world, and all I could do was wait, praying that whatever it was would go away. After driving for what felt like hours, Hal finally stopped the car at a seemingly inconspicuous clearing in the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was almost oppressive. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. Hal quickly began unloading the car, preparing for the night ahead, while Maya and I set up the tents. Though Hal had insisted we would enjoy the true camping experience, it wasn't long before I began to feel out of place, as if something was watching us. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort against the growing sense of unease. Hal told stories, mostly jokes from his scouting days. But I could tell his mood had shifted. His usual confidence had dimmed, and he seemed more alert, more on edge. Maya, too, grew quiet, her eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The sounds of the forest were oddly muted. The usual chorus of night creatures, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, was absent. It was as if the woods themselves had fallen into a strange, unnatural silence. The fire crackled and popped, breaking the tension briefly, but the silence beyond it felt suffocating. Then, I heard it, a sound, distant at first, but unmistakable, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but with a rhythm that suggested something far too large to be a deer or any other forest creature. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at Hal, but his face was serious, no longer smiling or joking. He motioned for us to be quiet, his finger pressed to his lips, signaling for us to listen. There are places in this world where the veil between reality and the unknown is thin, places where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the lines between what is real and what is imagined blur beyond recognition. It is in these places, often found deep within nature's untamed wilderness, where some of our most terrifying experiences lie. Not the kind of terror we associate with haunted houses or dark alleys in the city, but something primal, something raw, something that shakes us to our core. I learned this lesson the hard way, on a camping trip with my best friend, Hal. Hal had always been a nature lover. An Eagle Scout with a deep understanding of the woods, he had spent countless nights out in the wilderness, finding peace among the trees. He was the kind of person who found solace in the solitude of nature. But for me, camping was a whole new world, one that I wasn't entirely sure I belonged in. I had heard the stories, of course, the tales of things that went bump in the night, the eerie howls carried on the wind, the strange whispers in the trees, but they always seemed like nothing more than exaggerated myths. That was until I experienced something that couldn't be explained, something that would forever change the way I saw the wild. One afternoon, Hal invited me on a camping trip, promising it would be a simple, fun getaway. We were joined by his girlfriend, Maya, and the three of us set off down a dirt road that, in hindsight, seemed far too secluded for comfort. Hal, ever the seasoned adventurer, had a spot in mind, a place off the beaten path, far from any established campsite. As we drove further into the wilderness, the landscape grew more isolated, the trees thicker, the silence heavier. I began to feel the unease creeping in, though I tried to push it aside. In the end, we moved out of that apartment, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It stayed with me in the form of a quiet unease, a lingering fear that never quite went away. It made me question what we can't see, what we don't understand. It made me realize that there are things lurking in the shadows, in the spaces between, that we may never fully comprehend. And it taught me that sometimes, the scariest thing is not the monster under the bed, but the one who watches you from the dark, from behind the walls, just out of sight. The unknown is often far more terrifying than anything we could ever imagine. And sometimes, the things we fear the most are not the things we can see, but the things we can't. In the end, we moved out of that apartment, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It stayed with me in the form of a quiet unease, a lingering fear that never quite went away. It made me question what we can't see, what we don't understand. It made me realize that there are things lurking in the shadows, in the spaces between, that we may never fully comprehend. And it taught me that sometimes, the scariest thing is not the monster under the bed, but the one who watches you from the dark, from behind the walls, just out of sight. The unknown is often far more terrifying than anything we could ever imagine. And sometimes, the things we fear the most are not the things we can see, but the things we can't. When my mom finally arrived home, I was nearly hysterical. She listened to my frantic explanation, but she didn't believe me. She said I was imagining things, that it was just the old building settling. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. Something was in that apartment with me, and it was watching. It wasn't until later that I began to piece together what had really been happening. The old man, always sitting outside his door, always watching me. The strange noises. The whispers. It all made sense now, in a way that it didn't before. He had been watching me, listening to me, from the very walls that separated our apartments. He had drilled holes into the walls, creating tiny peepholes, so he could observe me whenever I was alone. The entire time I had thought I was being paranoid, he had been spying on me. The terror I felt that night wasn't just the fear of an unseen person. It was the fear of violation, of being invaded in a way that went beyond the physical. The fear of realizing that you have no privacy, that someone has been watching you when you thought you were alone. The fear of being powerless, of knowing that no matter how hard you try, you can never truly escape. I didn't dare open the door. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind screaming for me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to move. I was trapped in that moment, unsure of what would happen next. Then, in the silence that followed, I heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't coming from the wall. They were coming from inside the apartment. Slowly, the room around me began to feel colder. The air grew heavy, thick with something that I couldn't name. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe, and then, in a fleeting moment of clarity, I realized something horrifying. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were voices. They were real. Someone was in the apartment with me. Hidden in the shadows, watching me from the corners of the room. I could feel their presence, though I couldn't see them. The weight of the air was a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to grab my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed my mom, hoping that she would pick up, that she would somehow save me from the growing terror. The phone rang and rang, but she didn't answer. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, trying to find any sign of movement. The whispers were getting louder, more distinct, like they were right behind me. I could hear the sound of something scraping against the walls, slow and deliberate. I jumped at every creak. Every movement in the darkness, too terrified to leave my room and check the apartment. I froze, the blood draining from my face. My thoughts raced in panic. What was happening? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I moved back from the wall and tried to dismiss the feeling as just my imagination running wild, but the fear lingered. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the quiet whispers becoming louder and more frantic. Suddenly, I heard a noise from the hallway outside my room. The floorboards creaked softly underfoot. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't my mom. She wouldn't be home for another hour or so. I pressed myself back against the wall, afraid that whoever was out there might hear my breath. The sound grew closer, and then there was a light tapping at my door. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was trapped, caught between the terror of the unknown and the fear of what was waiting for me just outside my door. I could hear the tapping again, followed by soft, rhythmic scratching, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I stared at the door, my mind racing with possibilities. It could have been anyone. It could have been the old man. It could have been someone I didn't even know, someone who had somehow slipped into the apartment unnoticed. One night, when my mom was working the late shift, I came home to find him sitting in his usual spot, staring out at me as I unlocked the door. His gaze was steady, unervingly so, and for the first time, I felt a shiver run down my spine. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at me, his gaze piercing through the hallway. I quickly shut the door behind me, eager to get away from his watchful eyes. That night, after I'd settled into my room, I started hearing things. Strange noises. At first, it was faint, just a low, grumbling sound, almost like someone was talking in the next room. But there was no one there. I figured it was just the old building settling, but the longer I listened, the more unsettling the sound became. It wasn't just a random noise, it sounded like murmuring. Low, almost inaudible whispers, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite manage to form words. I tried to ignore it, but the sound only grew louder, closer. It felt like it was coming from my bedroom wall, right next to where I was standing. My heart raced as I walked to the wall, pressing my ear against it to listen. The murmurs seemed to come from the other side. At that moment, a horrifying realization hit me. There was someone on the other side of that wall. Someone who had been listening to me for who knows how long. Someone who knew I was there, but I couldn't see them. There are moments in life that stretch the boundaries of our understanding, times when we are confronted with something so inexplicable that it leaves us questioning everything we once took for granted. These are not the ordinary fears, the fear of heights, the fear of spiders, or even the fear of the unknown. This is something far deeper, a fear that creeps into the very core of our being, shaking our confidence in what we know, and leaving behind a lingering sense of dread that refuses to fade. It was a quiet evening in the middle of summer, and I had just moved into an old apartment building with my mom. The kind of building that looked perfectly fine on the outside, but felt strangely off on the inside. There were things about it that didn't sit right with me. The floors creaked too loudly for such a new building. The walls were thin, and the air always felt heavy, as though it had been trapped inside for too long. But the one thing that unsettled me the most was my neighbor, an older man who lived at the very end of the hall. He was always there. Always sitting on the windowsill just outside his door, staring at me with an emotionless expression whenever I passed by. There was something strange about him, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I would often hurry past, my heart racing just a little faster as I walked by. My mom always told me to stay away from him. But I never really understood why. He was just another neighbor, wasn't he? But the longer I lived there, the more I began to realize that there was something different about him. Something unnerving. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me with a profound understanding. The unknown is not something we can conquer, and sometimes the greatest fear is not the thing we can't see, but the thing we can't understand. The terror I felt wasn't just the fear of being watched, it was the fear of encountering something that existed beyond the boundaries of reason, something that was always there, just out of sight, waiting for us to confront it. It was the realization that the world we inhabit is not as it seems, and that there are forces at play that we may never fully understand. And that is what makes it so terrifying, the knowledge that there are things in the world that we cannot explain, and perhaps, we were never meant to understand them. The hours dragged on, each moment feeling like an eternity, each second weighted with the oppressive sense of being watched. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, checking corners of rooms, looking into mirrors, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing just out of sight. But there was nothing. Yet, I knew it was there. I knew that something was lurking in the spaces between, just beyond the reach of my senses, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And that, in itself, was enough to send waves of fear through me, a terror that had no physical form, no recognizable shape, but existed purely in the mind. It wasn't until later that I began to understand what had happened. It wasn't about a person or an entity hiding in the shadows. It wasn't about a tangible presence that I could confront or fight. It was about the limits of human understanding, the spaces where the mind reaches but cannot grasp, where the world slips just out of focus, and the things that exist outside the realm of what we can see and touch. In that moment, I had been confronted with something far more terrifying than any ghost or monster. I had been faced with the sheer unknowability of the world around me, with the terrifying truth that there are forces beyond our comprehension, forces that we cannot control, forces that we cannot explain. I turned away from the window, heart pounding in my chest, and walked through the house, searching for something, anything, that could explain the strange feeling that gripped me. But the house was empty, the silence deafening. I opened doors, peered into rooms, but everything was as it should be. Nothing was out of place. There was no tangible threat, no immediate danger that I could see or hear. But the sense of being watched, of being followed, refused to leave. I could feel it, a presence that was just beyond my line of sight, moving with me, staying just out of reach, like a shadow that followed my every step. The strange thing about this feeling was that it wasn't just an emotional response. It was as if my body itself was attuned to something beyond the physical world. My skin prickled, my heart raced, and my mind swirled with thoughts of who, or what, could be watching me. It was a fear that didn't make sense, but it was undeniable. I couldn't explain it, I couldn't rationalize it, but I could feel it in my bones, in my gut, deep in the core of my being. And that was what terrified me the most, the fact that it was beyond explanation, beyond understanding. It was something that had no reason, no cause, no origin that I could trace. It was an encounter with the unknown, with something that lurked beyond the veil of perception, waiting, watching, but never showing itself. This was no longer a feeling that could be dismissed with a shake of the head or a logical explanation. No, this was something more, something that could not be reasoned away. The air seemed to hum with a low, unspoken tension, as if the very space around me had become charged with a presence that wasn't my own. I stood motionless for a moment, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the room, but nothing was out of place. There was no shadow in the corner, no movement in the air. But the sense of being watched, of being observed, pressed down on me with increasing intensity. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the space around me had shrunk to the point where I was no longer alone. Even though I could see no one, I went to the window, hoping that the sight of the outside world would ground me, would dispel the unease that had settled over me. The street was quiet, the houses across the way dark and still. No one was watching me. I could see no eyes peering from behind curtains, no figures lurking in the shadows. The world outside seemed to carry on as usual. But then I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, this time stronger than before. It wasn't just an idea or a fleeting thought, it was a physical weight, a pressure on my chest, as if something was closing in on me from all sides. I felt as though I were being drawn into a space I couldn't escape. As if I had stepped into a world where the rules I understood no longer applied. I stood up from my chair, trying to shake the strange sensation that had settled over me, but it only deepened. It was the feeling of being watched, though not in the way you might expect. It wasn't a simple glance from someone across the room, or the sense that someone was following you down a dark street. No, this felt different. It felt more pervasive, as if my entire being was under observation, not just my actions, but my thoughts, my very essence. It was as if something, or someone, was standing just outside my perception, observing me in ways I couldn't understand, unable to be seen, yet always present. It was a violation that went beyond physical space, a deep and primal sense that my privacy had been invaded in a way that transcended the material world. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, it seemed so absurd. How could I be watched when there was no one there? The house was empty, the doors locked. There was no rational explanation for the feeling. But as I moved about the room, as I paced back and forth, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before, that this sensation wasn't fleeting. It wasn't a passing moment of paranoia. It was real as the walls around me, as real as the floor beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen, was close, just outside my reach, lingering on the periphery of my vision. I felt it in the air, in the way the room seemed to grow colder, in the silence that stretched too long. Too thick, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. There are experiences in life that we cannot explain, that defy logic and reason, moments that linger in our memory long after they've passed, not because they were pleasant, but because they were so far beyond our understanding that they haunt us. These are the experiences that make us question the nature of reality itself. We often go through life believing that we can explain everything, that there is a reason for everything, a cause and effect that governs the universe. But every so often, we encounter something so profound, so utterly inexplicable, that it shakes us to the core. It challenges the very way we perceive the world, and leaves us grappling with an unsettling truth: there are things beyond our comprehension. This truth came crashing into my life in a way that I never expected, a moment that would challenge everything I thought I knew. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those afternoons where nothing special was happening, where the world seemed to move at its usual pace, unhurried and predictable. I was alone, in my room, just another day spent in solitude, lost in the hum of my own thoughts. I had always been the type to enjoy my own company, to find comfort in the quiet. But that day, something shifted. The air around me felt heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. It wasn't anything overt at first. There were no signs, no warnings. Just a subtle feeling that I couldn't place. Like a shadow hanging over me, not quite there, but always just on the edge of my awareness. As the night dragged on, the feeling persisted. I couldn't escape it. The fear of being watched was not something that could be solved by simply checking under the bed or locking the doors. It wasn't something that could be chased away with rational thought. It lingered, creeping into every corner of my mind, feeding off my uncertainty. It was a fear that was not meant to be dismissed. It was something I had to face head-on, to accept that some things exist in the dark, waiting, watching, and we may never know what they truly are. It's strange, isn't it? How something so simple, so primal, can shape our reality. How the fear of being watched, of someone or something seeing us when we aren't looking, can unravel us. I think what scares us isn't just the idea of being observed, it's the idea that we have no control over what is watching, and the unnerving realization that there are forces beyond our understanding, forces that may not have any reason to explain themselves to us. The fear of being watched isn't just the fear of an intruder, it's the fear of exposure, of being vulnerable in a world where nothing is truly private. We live our lives assuming we are alone in our spaces, that we are free from prying eyes, but what if we aren't? What if there's always someone, or something, watching, waiting, just out of sight? That is the true horror of being watched, the knowledge that we are never truly alone. And that the spaces we inhabit are always susceptible to unseen forces. We may never know who or what is watching us. But perhaps, in a way, that's the scariest part of all. It's strange how something as simple as the idea of being watched can disrupt your entire sense of security. The walls that were once a source of comfort and safety now felt like barriers, trapping me with whatever unseen force lurked nearby. The feeling wasn't confined to one part of the house. It followed me, a constant shadow, no matter where I went. I walked into the kitchen, and there it was, creeping behind me. I went into the living room, and the feeling of eyes on me was still there, lurking just out of reach. It was as if the house itself had transformed into a place of danger, a space that was no longer mine, but something else's, something that watched and waited. The fear wasn't just about the presence that I felt. It was the uncertainty of it all, the not knowing. It was the feeling of being powerless in my own space, the realization that there was something out there, something I couldn't control, something that had crossed the invisible boundary between the outside world and the safety of my home. It's one thing to be afraid of something you can see, something you can understand. But it's an entirely different kind of terror when that fear is based on the unknown, on something you can't explain, something you can't name. And that's what terrified me the most, the idea that someone could be in my home, moving through the dark, watching me without me knowing. It was an invasion of my privacy. A violation of the safe space I had once taken for granted. It was a breach that couldn't be undone, a moment when I realized that the world I had created for myself, the walls, the doors, the windows, didn't offer the protection I thought they did. The terror wasn't in the physical reality of the house, but in the unknown, in the invisible threat that loomed just beyond my sight. I tried to shake off the thought and walked toward the window, determined to dismiss the unease that had taken root. Outside, the streetlights bathed the world in an eerie yellow glow, but no one was there. No movement. No figures. The street was empty. The houses around me stood silent, their windows dark. No one was watching me from outside. But then, I felt it again. The weight of eyes on my back. It wasn't just a sense of being watched, it was a force. The realization that someone had been there, somewhere, watching, was enough to send a chill through me. It was as if the walls of my own home had become a prison, and I couldn't escape the eyes that followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside the house with me. The air grew colder as I walked through the rooms, every shadow seeming deeper, every corner darker. My eyes darted from one space to the next, as if looking for something, or someone. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, or if there truly was someone hiding, watching from behind the closed doors or the empty hallway. I didn't want to be alone in the house anymore. I wanted to run. I wanted to call someone, anyone, to come and take away the unsettling presence that seemed to suffocate me. But I didn't. I stood there, gripped by the cold tendrils of fear. I realized, in that moment, that I was afraid of what I couldn't see, of what was hiding from me. There was no tangible threat. No clear danger that I could identify. But the sensation of being watched, the feeling that someone was just out of sight, somewhere in the dark, was so strong that it felt real, like a physical presence in the room. It was the kind of fear that twists your thoughts, makes you question everything around you, and leaves you feeling vulnerable, exposed, and utterly alone. I didn't want to admit it, but the feeling of being watched was growing. It wasn't just in the back of my mind anymore, it had moved forward, filling every corner of the room. I tried to push it away, tried to tell myself that it was just the stillness of the night, that there was nothing abnormal about the sense of quiet, that there was no reason to feel like someone was staring at me from the shadows. But the feeling intensified, a strange, almost palpable presence that hovered near me. I couldn't shake it. I looked around the room, almost expecting to see eyes peering out from the darkness, hidden behind the curtains or in the reflection of the glass. But nothing was there. No one was watching me. Or so I thought. It wasn't until I stood up to stretch, to distract myself from the creeping paranoia, that the realization hit me. I was not alone in my own house. The sensation was too real, too powerful to ignore. Someone, was watching me. But where were they? Was there someone outside my window? A neighbor peeking through the blinds? Was it a prank from one of my friends? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Yet, as I stood there in the middle of the room, frozen by the weight of the realization, I understood one thing: this wasn't just a passing fear. This was something deeper, something that wasn't easily explained. There's something about being watched that taps into the deepest corners of our primal fears. It's a feeling that most people can relate to, the sudden sensation that someone's eyes are on us, even when we can't see them. It could be a glance from across a room, or the eerie thought that someone is behind us when we're alone. In moments like these, we may tell ourselves it's nothing. Yet, deep inside, we know that something just doesn't sit right. There's an undercurrent of fear that we can't shake. The scariest part about this feeling is that it's not always obvious. The fear of being watched often starts as a subtle intuition, a strange awareness of the presence of something or someone just beyond our perception. We can't see it, we can't hear it, but we can feel it. It's a gut-wrenching sensation that gnaws at the back of our minds. For some, this sensation is fleeting, dismissed as a trick of the mind. But for others, it becomes a constant, gnawing terror, an invisible enemy that waits, watches, and invades personal space in ways that are impossible to confront. I remember one particular night when I couldn't ignore that feeling anymore. I was in my room, just another evening, and the air was thick with the quiet of a suburban neighborhood. The kind of quiet that feels almost unnatural, the type that only exists when everyone is tucked away in their homes, the world outside lost to the silence of the night. I had been reading a book, or maybe watching something on my computer. My focus was on something trivial, something that should have occupied my mind. Yet, the quietness of the house felt heavy, as if the silence itself were a looming presence. My thoughts seemed muffled, like I was hearing them from a distance, clouded by a strange pressure. Fear, in its purest form, is not just a reaction to danger. It is a response to the uncertainty of the world around us, the things we cannot control, the things that remain hidden just beyond our understanding. And that, I believe, is what makes fear so powerful. It connects us to something far greater than ourselves. It forces us to confront the darkness, even when we have no idea what's lurking within it. So, what do we do when faced with the unknown? How do we cope with the fear that creeps into our lives, uninvited, unwelcome? I think the answer is simple: we acknowledge it. We accept that fear is a part of life. And in doing so, we give ourselves the strength to face it, even when we don't have all the answers. And for me, that day taught me something valuable. Fear may make us feel small, insignificant, and powerless, but it also reminds us of the power we hold within ourselves. Because, despite the terror that gripped me that day, I survived it. And that, in itself, is an act of courage. I couldn't even bring myself to leave the bathroom, even when I heard the front door alarm go off. What was happening? What was in the house with me? And why was I so afraid of it? It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the entire house was against me, hiding some terrifying truth. The fear had taken over, and all I could do was wait, helpless and terrified. The moments that followed felt like hours. I stayed hidden, motionless, as the fear coursed through me. My mind was racing with every possible scenario, trying to make sense of what was happening. But no answer came. The terror persisted, and with it, the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, someone was in the house with me, waiting. Eventually, my parents came home, and the feeling of dread began to dissipate, but not entirely. It wasn't until later, when I spoke to Alex, that I began to understand the weight of what had happened. He told me about his own experiences with strange sounds in the house, but we could never figure out what it was. No explanation made sense. No logical answer could satisfy the terror I had felt in those moments, and that's the thing about fear. It doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't need to make sense. Sometimes, fear is just something that consumes you, that takes over, and leaves you with nothing but the question, what was that? The terror I felt that day was not from what I could see, but from what I couldn't see, what I couldn't understand. And in the end, I realized that some fears aren't meant to be understood. They are meant to remind us of the fragility of our existence, and of how vulnerable we are to the unknown. The sound grew closer, slowly, steadily, as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds was coming for me. My mind raced with panic. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My thoughts were scattered, irrational. I couldn't even form a coherent plan. All I knew was that I needed to hide. I needed to be as quiet as possible, as invisible as possible. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, praying that whatever was on the other side of that door wouldn't notice me. My instincts told me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The fear was paralyzing, and in that moment, I felt utterly powerless. The footsteps continued, each step growing louder, until they stopped right outside the bathroom door. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. Then, just as suddenly, the noise began again, but this time it was coming from the stairs. The loud thuds reverberated through the house, echoing down the hallway. Each step was heavy, deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving toward me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The terror that gripped me was so intense that it almost felt suffocating. When the noise reached the stairs, the pounding became louder. It wasn't just walking. It was the sound of something crashing, something powerful moving through the house. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think clearly. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't a simple intruder. No, this was something else, something I couldn't explain. The air around me seemed to shift. The quiet that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating. I turned off the sink, my hands trembling as I locked the bathroom door behind me. The noise had stopped, but the tension in the house remained. It was almost as if I was waiting for something, or someone, to make their presence known. My stomach churned with anxiety, the sensation of being watched intensifying. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was fear of something I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't explain. It was a fear that dug deep into my soul, pulling out every ounce of rationality and replacing it with a primal, instinctive terror. The feeling of being watched was inescapable. I waited, still, silent, hoping that the fear would dissipate. But instead, it grew. Then I heard it. The faint sound of murmuring, but not Alex's voice. It wasn't my dad's either. It was deep, guttural, almost animalistic. It seemed to come from the direction of my brother's room. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was speaking, low and menacing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound continued. I felt a chill run through me, freezing me in place. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It couldn't be real. There was no way it could be real. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that something was in the house with me, something I couldn't see, but that I could feel. The footsteps that followed the murmuring only confirmed my worst fears.